Folks, all of you know that Legacy Precious Metals is a great sponsor of the Doug Collins podcast, and I can't tell you right now a more important time to know Legacy Precious Metals. They're right now, your investment portfolio, if you look at the stock market right now, you look at the inflation that's going on, you look at the uncertainty out there, I'm going to tell you, the investments that you're making need to have gold and silver to be a part of it. You need the precious metals. Navigators are people who have been there, they know what to look out for, and they know how to come back and navigate you through the streams of your financial situation, whether it's for your retirement or whether it's just in your long-term investment strategies. Legacy Precious Metals folks are people who listen. They listen to you, they listen to your needs, and they help you navigate this uncertain financial times. When you're seeing the fluctuations back and forth, people will actually need to find a place where they have a portfolio that is balanced. Having gold and silver in that portfolio is something that you can have as part of yours. Just go find them at legacypminvestments.com.
Do you want to listen to a podcast?
By who? Georgia GOP Congressman Doug Collins.
How is it?
The greatest thing I have ever heard in my whole life.
I could not believe my ears.
In this house, wherever the rules are disregarded, chaos and mob rule. It has been said today, where is bravery? I'll tell you where bravery is found and courage is found. It's found in this minority who has lived through the last year of nothing but rules being broken, people being put down, questions not being answered, and this majority say, be damned with anything else. We're going to impeach and do whatever we want to do. Why? Because we won an election. I guarantee you, one day you'll be back in the minority and it ain't gonna be that fun. All right, folks, Doug Collins Podcast, glad to have you. We're already into the conversation here with Kelley Vlahos here from the Quincy Institute. It's going to be an interesting conversation today because it really hits at the heart of something that I've been dealing with for a long time because I've lived it. 20 years of, almost come March 1st, 20 years of being in the United States Air Force, still in, Lieutenant Colonel. Was in the Navy got my original training in the Navy. I went from one blue to another blue in the military perspective. Served in Iraq, and the geopolitics of my whole career, if you think about it, I was back in 2002, I was in 92, 94, has been dominated by, frankly, America in armed conflict. I mean, we have been that way for the entire time. So, Kelley, let's just, as we jump into this in sort of your background, especially with the Ukraine sort of looming over us here, just as your perspective, where do you see the American military right now?
I mean, I see the American military as and I hate to use this because it's such a Washington term, at an inflection point. I think after the Afghanistan withdrawal, you had a lot of veterans and rank and file military questioning the war policy of the last 20 years. How did we get to the point where we spent all of these resources, all of these lives, to get back to square one and leave the Taliban in control? And to blame it just on Biden's withdrawal or Trump's deal with the Taliban it's not fair and it's not reality. The reality is that the policy was bad in the first place, and you had members of the military as well as the American public listening to their generals, listening to their politicians talk about how victory was always right around the corner, and that if we only did X, Y, and Z and put tens of thousands of more troops in year after year, that we would prevail. And they saw that all go up in smoke during that Afghanistan withdrawal. And I think between that, the over-politicization of our generals, and just the global war on terror, the outcomes not meeting what we had been promised as a country, all combined for some real soul searching on what our military is for, who we're fighting for, the Washington policies that we believed in, the institutions that we believed in. So I think that the military is suffering just like every other institution in this country. They're suffering from a lack of trust from the American people. And frankly, in many ways, I think they deserve it.
Yeah. Well, so much to unpack, and this is going to be a great show, folks. We got a lot to dig into here. But let's just start off with you brought up something. I've made this comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I made it on many interviews and other things where I believe that the Biden administration right now, which is reaping the problematic effects of the Afghanistan, we brought up Afghanistan, I believe that many of their poll problems, their perception problems, I believe Americans are very forgiving is probably a decent word, at least it has been for years, of domestic policy screw ups. You spend too much money, you don't spend enough money, I'm for healthcare, you're for not. People are sort of forgiving there. What they're not forgiving, I think Democrats, Republicans, independents across the board, is they're not forgiving of an embarrassment on the national stage. They're not forgiving of America looking and perceived to be very weak, which is, I think, what happened in Afghanistan. Needing to get out, that's a given. How it happened and how it went down, and especially with the reports that we've just seen coming out this week, even from the own internal, which is hard to believe, Pentagon criticizing this issue. Do you think that is that the Afghanistan right now will go down as one of Biden's biggest problematic issues in his administration so far?
I do, and I agree with your first thought that we should have gotten out of that war, but the way we did it was problematic and it left a stain. And I also agree that the American people are very forgiving. But when you're told pretty much your entire lifetime, now I'm Generation Xer, so I grew up during the Reagan years. I grew up believing that my country was powerful, and it was not only powerful militarily in its strength, but its cause was powerful, and that it would prevail over evil. I mean, it was a very Manichaean world, the worldview that I grew up in. And we spent the last 20 years believing in the cause, whether it be against, the extremism in the world, for the liberation of people who lived under tyranny, and to see all that fall apart. And it's not just with Afghanistan, for Iraq as well, where we told we were liberating a country, and now, they're just begging for us to leave. And there's pretty much, I don't want to say there's a failed state there, but there's not the political panacea that we were hoping to build there.
Yeah,
so it's
no
kind of
it's
a letdown, and it causes you to wonder, to question everything about your government, about the state, about the strength of the state, and all of the mythologies that had been built up around the United States and its purpose in the world.
You made an interesting comment, and there's so much, again, you go on a lot of shows, your own, variety shows like I Am Tucker, Fox, everything, Newsmax. We're all on talking about things like this as they happen, sort of the real-time punditry. But the interesting thing that I've never heard, and you just brought it up, was you qualifying your worldview rightfully, because I am as well a Gen X. Okay, I'm an older Gen X in that sense, and we're that different generation. We're the first generation, before internet, before cell phones, before all these kind of things, and in a generation that has had to grow in this process. And I think one of the things that you just hit that's really important. How much of the Gen X, which will be older military right now, your senior officers, senior enlisted, how much are they struggling internally? I know I am, but they're struggling with their position in the military or just getting out of the military, younger Gen X and then millennials coming in. Do you think there's that generational issue there?
I absolutely do, for all the reasons that I mentioned, because your formative years are shaped by your surroundings, and in the case of older Gen X people, particularly those in the military, those years were marked by confrontation with Iran, confrontation with the Soviet Union, the nuclear arms race, the Rocky movies. You name it. It was
now. The Rocky movies. We done got to my heart now. You're like, yo, Kelley, we don't messing with the Rocky movies. Adrian said this is a good thing,
Right, and you remember, was it Rocky IV?
Yeah.
Was it U.S. versus the Soviet Union? And we were all standing up in the aisles and cheering. And so it was a culture that we grew up with.
If I can change, you can change. We can all change.
Right.
Absolutely. I love it.
And we didn't cringe. The younger folks, I'm not going to date myself too much, but the younger folks didn't cringe at that stuff. Today, Gen Z particularly would cringe from here to the dawn by any suggestion of uber patriotism in a movie like that. It's passe. They don't believe in it. So I would imagine you're younger. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Skepticism to me is healthy, but it does mark a difference between your younger military individuals and the older ones who grew up in that year that might be feeling a little bit more disillusioned, when they see that their government is not acting the way that they perceived or thought it would in their name.
I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, wormhole, whatever we want to call it, but what you're saying there actually begins to have the thoughts of, after 200 plus years of us as a country, are we seeing the very institutions that sustain that 200 plus year, growth? Is this a positive change? Is this a negative change? Is this the bell curve operating? I mean, I think there's questions that we have to begin, and it starts with what you said with the military, because that is the underpinning of our national security and our national health, if you would, in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you'll like my answer, but I agree with some of my conservative military friends who are real critical of the last 20 years of the war policies. They're critical of the military today. And they says, well, and I'm prefacing this here, they say, well, maybe we need to lose a few wars, maybe we should stop encouraging people to join the military. And that would cause the leadership, at the top, which many agree that that's where the rot is coming from, to change course. Maybe we need to purge the generals. Maybe we don't need as many generals and combatant commands as we have. And maybe this might be the beginning of a real reform from within. And it's going to hurt, and it's not going to be pretty. But in the end, we might have a stronger institution that we can be proud of again.
Well, I think you just interestingly brought up something there that is this general to member ratio is just, again, it's very, very, very top heavy, which I don't think a lot of people would actually understand. Me being in the military, I get it. I mean, there's a lot of issues, and it sort of mimics Washington's bureaucracy. I mean, people don't understand. I just did a podcast just the other day with a gentleman who we talked about how bureaucracy hits every room in your house with regulations that never went through Congress. I mean, it's a similar kind of setup here. But, to your question, I sort of asked the question back. If they said, quote, lose one, what do they call Afghanistan and Iraq? I mean, I don't think anybody would call those clear victories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a giant wake-up call the last 20 years. I mean, as you recall, I mean, we put tens of thousands of troops into Iraq in the invasion, which is coming up on, 19 years? The 19th year anniversary in March. And I mean, we just rolled in there. We had CNN cameras running and, shock and awe. And I think there was a feeling that this was going to be over quickly. I mean, we had all of our strength and all of our military capability on display. And then spent the last 20 years, all the way up until now, we still have troops there, fighting insurgents who have a fraction of what we have in terms of weapons and gear. And it really sort of exposed the soft underbelly of our military capabilities, that money and big weapon systems can mean nothing when up against an ardent, a very rigorous adversary who wants us out of their country. And I think understanding culture and understanding the enemy goes a long way. And I feel like Washington never got that. All they got was pouring more money into stuff.
Hey, that's an interesting quote. As someone who was in Iraq, I was there in the Balad, north of Baghdad, up in the near to Korea, that triangle area up there where we were not very welcomed. On one village, the other village tolerated us, but we were mortared almost every day. In fact, multiple times a day. Because it was just that insurgent. You brought up an interesting point here, and again, it's amazing how these kind of conversations turn. And it is the point is sort of startling when you start looking at it. When the budget, National Defense Authorization Act, everything always comes up. It is, and also right now we're dealing with a CR, which military people just hate because the procurement officers can't do long-term purchasing under a CR. They can only do it through through regular appropriations. So they're sort of stuck. It is amazing to me how we're still looking at big systems to deal with someone in an AK-47 in the back of a bombed out hut. And I'm not sure we've actually still grasped that very well.
I don't think we grasp it because the military industrial complex as it is really dominated by special interests. And so it's fine if, these top 5 defense contractors want to keep pushing their programs that cost millions, and in the case of the F-35, $1 trillion, all said and done. They don't really care that by the time it's actually done, like the F-35, which is still not fully performance capable, that it's obsolete, because they're just in it for their profits, for their bottom line, for their shareholders. And when you have an entire ecosystem that's driven by these special interests, they're not focused on whether or not that we can fight the enemy in the moment. They're focused on other things themselves. And I know that's a harsh way of looking at it, but the more people that I have talked to over the years who have worked in the Pentagon, that understand how it actually operates, how that ecosystem is able to sustain itself, and where all that money goes that our taxpayers are forking over year after year, I'm convinced that that's really where a lot of this rot is coming from. And so we have these big hammers going after these and looking for nails, but the big hammers aren't even working anymore.
Well, I think, again, it's amazing because it's harder to define an enemy. And in fact, I'm in the middle of Air War College now. I'm doing, and still the understanding of war as we develop it is still in many ways a not wink and a nod toward the insurgent style activities we've seen in Iraq, Afghanistan. You see it in Boko Haram on the Horn of Africa and other places like that. But it's still toward the major player actors, not unrightfully so. But Russia, China, let's line up. Here's my uniform. There's your uniform, and we go at it. Again, if that happens, and let everybody listen to this podcast, if that happens, your world is done. If we go back to a traditional World War III aspect, your life is done. Starbucks is over. It ain't happening. I mean, this is total destruction at that point, because you just don't put 2 or 3 elephants. The only thing that loses when that happens is the grass. When elephants fight, the grass loses, and we'll lose. Not per se America, but humanity in many ways. So we're still seeing these more toned down versions. But it still begs the question, and I'm going to give you a quote that I was told by a member of Congress while I was in Congress when we were doing OCO funding. I'm sure you remember the OCO funding. That was Congress's way around of funding the war without putting in the budget. I'm going to be real blunt here. And there was about 4 or 5 of us, and me being in the military, it caught many by surprise. I voted against every time. Because it was when we come up and to cut it, I'd vote for the cut in OCO funding. My vision was put it in the budget. If you need it, it should be in the budget. It shouldn't be outside. I had a member come up to me and I said, you shouldn't be voting for this. And they said, I know, but I haven't served. I can't explain that to my constituents if I'm quote, against the military. How big a thought of that in our country is that right now?
Well, I mean, I remember the early days of the war after 9/11. It was a huge thought. I mean, and it was near career suicide to come out against the run up to the Iraq War. Now, Afghanistan was different. A lot of people to this day are saying they were behind and still support the move to go into Afghanistan and go after those who had been responsible for Al-Qaeda. Everything kind of fell apart after that. And even those like myself who had been speaking out against the drive to the Iraq War invasion, you had to be very careful how you talked, what language you used, because you were either written off as some hard lefty pacifist or an unpatriotic conservative. And so a lot of members who maybe felt in their belly that some of these things, like the Patriot Act, for example, were not appropriate ways to respond, or even the war in Iraq, did think twice, because the people who really wanted to go to Iraq tied the policy to supporting the troops and supporting your military. And nobody wanted to be seen as not supporting the troops. We know how that went during Vietnam. There was still there was a tremendous overhang to that. And I feel like as a populace, the American people did not want to be seen as anti-troop. And I feel like the military fully took advantage of that and used that to stifle dissent.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is, and I want to keep down this road because I think we're leading up to an interesting discussion here in just a moment on Ukraine and where we're at right now. And some of that same kind of fervor is coming back. And it's interestingly enough coming from the left this time on Ukraine. But to put this in perspective, and it's something you've written about, it's something that, I want to go back on some of your writings, which have been very, I think, on point on some of this. You make reference in a lot of your writings about the use of the National Guard and Reserve. And instead of it being an operational force, it's becoming an operational force, not a ready reserve force. Do you think outside of the normal, which we see that, it's still less than half of 1% ever went overseas to serve in any of these wars. Okay, it's not a lot. What is the downside of using our Guard and Reserve forces basically as quasi-active?
Well, I as I've mentioned in my own writing, and this is just based on talking to people who are in the Guard, who are advocates of the Guard, that you're stretching a part-time force very thin. And so you have a situation where you have members of the Guard who have been redeployed over and over and over again. Now there are laws and protections about those people losing their jobs but in reality, some people, employers just can't keep a position open for somebody who is redeployed several times. So you have the employment situation, you have this sort of in and out, you have a situation where they have families that they're leaving behind, but yet they don't have the full-time support system of an active duty member of the military. So you're asking a part-time volunteer to do the same work and make the same sacrifices as a full-timer who does have the support system there. And you're using a lot of the equipment. One of the guys that I had talked to who's in the New Hampshire Guard had pointed out that a lot of the equipment, like the helicopters, for example, have been shipped overseas that actually should be at stateside fighting fires, and doing it and engaging in disaster relief, which the Guard does. And with, all of the natural disasters that this country has contended with over the last 5 years, and the issues at the border and other domestic crises, you're really asking a lot of these citizen soldiers. And I feel like if you want to engage in a protracted war for 20 years, you're going to have to convince the American people that they need to start, enlisting. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, we'll just keep our enlistment numbers at a certain level and basically go as business as usual in this country and not really make an effort to recruit, because we're going to be using all these citizen soldiers because they're just like there's an endless supply of them. If you're really behind and you feel strongly about being in a war for 20 years, you're going to have to up your game on the active duty.
Yeah. Well, and part of the problem is now, and there's a push that started several years ago, even from some personnel, manpower specialists from the Army, 3-star generals that has said, look, we're headed back to a draft. And if a draft is the only way to look at this, And, the pushback was as well, oh, if you have a draft, you're going to get people who don't want to be there. And it's going to be, they said, well, World War II turned out okay. Vietnam actually combatant-wise, it was okay. I mean, the kid from Harlem and the kid from North Georgia got along, and they fought, together as a cohesive unit because it's part of what you do. But you've hit something that is really interesting to me, and I think from your conversations with others, maybe to this podcast audience. I don't think they quite understand this issue of manpower and deployment, and they don't want to up these numbers because, number one, it costs a great deal, especially when you got the tagged in with your other equipment and everything else. But it also, from the reservist and guard perspective, big Army, big Air Force, big Navy are getting these folks basically like temporary workers at half cost. And look, I'm saying that as a reservist, and not to offend my big Air Force brethren, but we do this in many ways because you have Air Force active units that say we're not going to perform these functions, and it is causing a lot of stress down the line, if you would. And it's also, you talked about recruitment. You realize that the total pool of recruitment is shrinking such at a level that really what we're getting is very difficult for our recruiters to go after because the same ones are being recruited by Ivy League schools. It's just grown that small of a pot.
Right. And I was being a bit facetious when I said, well, up your game and start recruiting more. I don't think they can. And that's the problem. I think after 20 years of war, kids are deciding, I'm going to go to college or I'll go into some trade. I'm not necessarily going to join the military. So you're right. There's a shrinking pool of individuals who actually qualify, who are actually in shape to be in the military. That's also a problem as well.
That is a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. And so, and this all goes back to Washington wanting to have it both ways. So they want to fight these wars, but they don't want to reflect the urgency or the sacrifice. They want you to go about your business, and as long as they can get that 0.5% of Americans who are sacrificing quietly, they're happy. And, as far as the deployments go, I mean, we've talked broadly about Afghanistan and Iraq, but we were sending National Guard troops to Africa just last month. And I think a lot of listeners, as well as people I talk to on the street, they're like, what are we doing there? Well, we have this massive counterterrorism program that, we could talk about whether it's actually working, but we're just quietly sending troops to Syria, to Afghanistan, back and forth to Iraq, Africa rather, and most Americans don't even realize it's going on, and I think that's how Washington wants it.
Yeah, well, that is true. And as someone who, I'm at a headquarter location, I've been there for the last few years. I see the manpower movement. We know that, if you're in the military, you know what's happening. You see it all the time, and you see the stressors on that. Let's take all of what we just talked about, and we may come back to it, but I want to switch it because I think we've now laid the groundwork in many ways for the problem that we're associating now with two areas. First being, the foremost area is Ukraine. And I think that's got everybody's attention. Everybody's looking at it. And if you're, it's one of those things is where's the, striking the balance. And I have a hard time with Europe to start with on this. But there is also another issue that I think collaterally plays with that, and that is still the Taiwan issue. It's sort of a similar kind of way. Laying all that we've seen now, Ukraine, give us your take, and let's have some discussion about Ukraine.
Well, personally, I think the only way out of this jam is through diplomacy. I think the idea that the United States is going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine is ridiculous. I don't think it's going to happen, but I feel all the rhetoric is moving in that direction. And as such, it is giving Ukraine maybe a false security that we're actually going to move in and defend them. And I don't think that history bears that out. So I think there's a lot, there are a lot of rhetorical dangers in terms of the way that our leadership, whether it be the Biden administration or members of Congress, are pushing for a military solution to the problem. And I feel like when I say diplomacy is the only answer, I think that there is a template for this. I mean, we have the Minsk II agreement, for example. We have demands and then we have responses. Russia doesn't want us to expand NATO into their backyard any further. I don't think that Ukraine is ever going to be a member of NATO, so why don't we just say it? Instead of playing this game of chicken, I feel that's happening right now that is just escalating us towards a confrontation that nobody seems to really want to engage in. And I'm afraid, just going back to our last point, that we'll look impotent, because if something happens and Russia invades Ukraine and NATO and or the United States say, sorry, we can't help you, we'll give you a few guns or whatever, we will look impotent again. We will look like we let our friends down. So why do we want to go there? So I feel like talking is the best way, but there are remnants of these this Washington establishment that always sees the military as a solution. And as somebody who's had family in the military, whose son is in the National Guard now, my host here, has been in the military. With all due respect, I feel like if we are going to engage in yet another militaristic policy, we really got to be A, fully behind it, and B, know what we're doing and know that there's no other alternatives.
Right. Well, it's interesting in this part because, again, one of your colleagues from Quincy, Anton, was on here, and we talked about this. Ukraine is really in a isolated state. And I mean this way. And as we brought this out, they're not a member of the EU. They're not a member of NATO. They're under the Russian arm, and really most people don't realize this. I mean, Kiev, the whole area of Ukraine, is the heart of what we would originally known as the original Soviet Union. It's a part of who they are. Okay, granted, Crimea and others was an easy sort of takeover because of the language barriers. Now it's becoming more militaristic. Do you see a diplomatic out in, like you said, just simply saying, look, NATO is off limits to the Ukraine. We'll have more EU trade and things like that. But in regard, and maybe your diplomacy aspect here is say, Mr. Putin, we'll agree to that, knowing that that we're not going to satisfy if you just become a satellite. But you're also going to have to give some assurances as well that what you've taken is all you're going to take it, and the Ukraine stays in its sovereign mode as best as that can be determined.
I agree. And my colleague Anatol even has spoke much more eloquently than I on this, but he's for a situation of full autonomy for Ukraine, similar to Finland after World War II, in which they don't join NATO, they don't become part of an anti-Russia alliance, nor do they become part of Russia and become part of any of their security architecture. So they are autonomous. Now, there are issues with the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, where you have a major Russian ethnic contingent there. I feel that there will have to be talks about that region and whether or not it is separated out at some point as its own sovereign state, not necessarily part of Russia. But that's all in those Minsk II agreement talks. Now, they didn't work out before, but there's no reason why there can't be a concerted effort to get back to the table. And I know that France, under Emmanuel Macron, has been shuttling back and forth between Putin and Ukraine this week. And, he's talking about some of the things we're talking about on the show. There's also the issues of the military exercises and where our nuclear weapons are stationed. These are all things that need to be hammered out. And I feel like if we come to the table by just making demands and saying, if you don't do this, we're going to shut down Nord Stream 2, or we're going to give Ukraine all these weapons. And I feel like that's not going to get us anywhere. And I know there are listeners who are saying, no, we don't want to give in to Putin. Why should we? He's such a terrible guy. And we don't want to look weak in that regard. But I do feel at this point there are enough things on the table that compromise is actually in the offing, and it's not all us compromising either. Russia's going to have to do its bit, and it's got to get those troops off the border. If we're gonna take back some of our exercises and take some of our ships out of there, then they're going to have to do the same. But that's what diplomacy is for.
Well, there's an old military basically adage that you can't keep a military on ready forever. It's either you move them or you use them, one way or the other. You just can't keep doing it indefinitely, even in a communist state, that is turned that back, or totalitarian state such as Russia. The interesting question comes, and I think this is the one that you've hit on it. So let's unpeel it just a little bit more. Let's just say, as we're speaking, which I do think is rather hilarious that Macron is the one, dealing the diplomacy here. He's
got his own motives.
Yeah, motives, definitely. Nobel, I guess, but because he hasn't helped anywhere else in the world. But okay, we'll do here. But let's just say, as we're speaking here, and I hope not. There's twofold to this question. You brought up Nordstrom. President Biden, in a press conference with the German chancellor yesterday, said if they go in, Nordstrom's over. When challenged on that by a reporter, the reporter said, well, that's more in Germany's control. And then he popped up and said, oh, no, it will happen immediately. And the German chancellor's right there. That kind of rhetoric's not helpful, is it?
No, it's not. And I remember an early press conference between Biden and Angela Merkel, at the beginning of Biden's term, in which, they basically settled. They said if Russia makes aggressive moves into Ukraine, that Angela Merkel was fully on board with sanctioning this project. But now it turns out that we want more from Germany. We want them to shut it down now, pretty much. But it's their choice. And this is the thing with the United States. We can't bulldoze and bully our friends because they won't be there to help us out when we really need them. So why are we going to make a big deal over Nord Stream 2? And I realize that people have some strong feelings about its very existence. But at this point, we need the Germans to be on our side if we're going to show a united front against Russia and this Ukrainian crisis. So why spend all this time bullying them on camera and saying, you will do what we say, client state, if they might just turn around like they have and say, we're not fully on board with our NATO obligations in this regard. And then we look even more impotent than we did before.
Well, and I think the bigger problem here is not just, if we were dealing with Nordstrom in isolation, it'd be one thing. We're not, though. And I think that's the realization for many conservatives and those of us. When you have an administration that has been at war with our own energy independence from day one on pipelines and everything else, okay, why are you against our pipelines but in favor, at the time in favor of theirs and now using it as a toy? I think that's where you look at. Take the second part of that, though. And this is why I do not believe, even with Biden's speak or misspeak, however you want to put it, of a minor incursion, I think Putin is playing, as I've heard it described, a judo session here. He's pushing, pulling, seeing where he can win, try and win on point. Anatol, your friend, and he's been on the podcast as well. We had an interesting conversation about this. Sort of set this up. But what bothers me, and we're talking about it from a more of a military perspective, is this. Europe is not gearing up for war. Period. They're not. And not even Poland, not even others. They're just sort of sitting back saying, hey, America, you going to send some folks here? And, whatever you feel about the NATO and the 2%, which I think is a joke, and it needs to be either uplift to or not live to, one way or the other way to fix it. Is that not playing? Why is that part not playing as well? Or is it playing in Europe more than it's playing here, that this is a problem, but it's not one that we're willing to send troops, equipment, and death for?
Yeah, and I think that they are playing a little bit of a shell game, because when they announced a week or so now, that we were putting 8,000 troops on alert, everybody was like, ooh, oh my goodness, we're putting, and then as you know, as a military guy, that's not a lot of people, and then if we're putting 8,000, some of these other countries are putting a fraction of that on alert. And so when it all said and done, it's not much of a show of force. But I feel like the delivery, the rhetoric, the performance is all geared to showing to the domestic audience that we mean business. But like you said, when you parse it all out, if we really mean business, we're not going to do so well. And I feel like there has been a concerted effort by Antony Blinken and other members of the administration to act as though that NATO is completely unified on this issue. And like you said, it's not. So we have France is doing its own thing. The UK is with us. They got their own thing going. They've gotten out of the EU. They want to show that they have their own foreign policy, that they got their own identity. They want to hitch it to us. They want to keep us, active in European geopolitics. They don't want to get us out like Macron does. So they got their own thing. But then you have Poland and Latvia and these others who are genuinely concerned because they're right over the border. They have their own history. But then you have others like Germany who are like, we're not really, that's a fraction of the NATO members there who are like, we have our own interests. We actually have trade with Russia. We definitely have energy interests with Russia. We don't want it all shut off. And we don't necessarily feel as endangered as you're making us out to be. So there are all sorts of fractionalism going on here that I don't think gets through the mainstream media when we're hearing about this at home.
I was, been about 3 or 4 years ago now, I was in Slovakia, I was in Czech Republic, Germany, in that area. And even then there was a real sense of frustration because this was around the Crimea time. It was right after the Crimea time, and it was in Russia today. The propaganda that is in Eastern Europe is pretty amazing when you look at it. I'm going to just throw a sort of a curveball question here, not to trip either one of us up, but just to sort of look at it. In listening to you talk right then, and it's something I think a lot of us, especially conservatives, we've seen, especially being frustrated with the European Union and their work, and also realizing, and everybody says, well, you got Britain. Well, they need to really look at Britain right now. The military power of Britain is very, they undercut themselves in many ways for an amazing reason, money. They just quit. They said, we're not going to spend the money. We're going to wait till we get the money in the bank. But they're not there. Does this, are you sensing, take Ukraine sort of out of the pocket for a minute, because I'm concerned about the geopolitical side of Ukraine, Black Sea, Turkey, it was the Obama administration and then continued into the Trump administration, Russia gaining a foothold with Turkey into Syria. That's a whole dynamic there that is different. Is there, and you made this statement that said, Germany, we're concerned about our own interests. We've heard this before out of Europe. Are we getting to a time when a Xi or a Putin might decide, hey, this is the time, if we want to move, they're going to sort of sell the property because they're not willing to defend it? I mean, are we at a point now that, that they could view this as a chance to move? And if so, what is our response?
Yeah, and I'm just not sold on that idea. I'm not saying that it's not a possibility, but I feel as though both of these powers would have moved already. We've been in a situation, domestically, this country has been ripped asunder, in terms of our politics, our economy, the pandemic, which of course the rest of the world is dealing with a lot of the same thing. I would like to say that there's just as much propaganda here as you've probably heard, like you mentioned, in Eastern Europe. And I say that because I have a long-standing beef with the mainstream media here. And what I've been and that's on the left and the right. And I've heard members of Congress over the last week or so saying that if we don't stop Putin, he is going to reconstitute the Soviet Union because that's what he wants. And I have seen no evidence of that. Is he super nationalistic? Does he want to regain the old glory of Russia? Of course, this has been going on since like he took over after the 90s when they were like basically trying to build up from rock bottom. So I get that he is very nationalistic, and he has definitely motives, and he is not a good actor in any sense. But this idea that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union and he's just going to start rolling into these former Soviet republics, taking them over one by one. And I say, where's the evidence? You know, wouldn't he have started already? He had Crimea in 2014, you know, that's almost 8 years ago. And so I feel like there's a lot of propaganda on this side, making people nervous, making them feel like if we don't move now, it's going to be never. And I feel the same about China. And I have no love lost for the Chinese government. I have plenty of complaints and criticisms about the way they treat their people, the surveillance state, the Uyghurs, what they've done in Hong Kong there, and bullying Taiwan. But I feel like there's the same rhetoric we're here in the United States, that if we don't move now, this massive hegemon is going to take over the world. And I don't think we've seen evidence of that yet either. So I'm just saying restraint. And that doesn't mean weakness. I just mean let's be smart and be strategic about how we approach these two powers.
Well, I think the interesting thing, Russia to me is still the militaristic. I still think there is a possibility, probability, however it is, either overthrow Zelensky, put something in. I think that those are undercurrent that you would have in Ukraine. And Russia is that power. Okay, that's their MO. China, though, has been different in many ways. They've taken over vast parts of infrastructure in Africa, Central America, South America, and haven't done a thing militarily in those countries. They've done it with their purchasing power. And if you've ever been to South Africa, if you've been to Zambia and all these other places down in South Africa, where they're going in and rebuilding the ports, they're rebuilding infrastructure using their own labor, and it's caused some friction. But then they're gaining footholds into these countries without ever firing quote a military shot. And that's often underreported in my mind.
Yeah, it's all blobbed together in the reporting in the mainstream. Like you said, oh yeah, they're taking over Africa, they're taking over all these, the Belt and Road. This proves their hegemonic designs. Well, maybe economically, yes. Will it work? I don't even know. I mean, I've read different accounts of how well that Belt and Road is actually doing and how much it's costing them and how much they've drawn back some of the funding for these projects. But so far it hasn't been military. And that's not to say that at some point it won't, because I can almost feel like when I talk about this, people bristling on the other end saying, well, that's just letting your guard down. But like with you, I want to see more evidence that's the real impulse of the Chinese government.
They've sort of made their own port stops. I think that's the interesting part, especially as they've grown their Navy. Although I think there's a lot of discussion, there's as you say, the propaganda or discussion, however you want to have it, about, their Navy's bigger than ours. Well, have you seen some of their ships? Okay, there's again, I would rather, if I'm in a race car, I'd rather have a NASCAR racing car than, the Ford Spirit, and I'm going to win in the race. Okay. They may have 45 Ford Spirits and, Ford cars in the race, but if I have the NASCAR, I'm going to win. Okay. In a track. But it is interesting to see that. And I think that's the conversations that we need to have because, again, we're in a world in which this is not an easy answer world anymore. It's not, and I'll go back to when we started this conversation about, Rocky IV, and Russia's the behemoth, we're the other behemoth. We the world is waiting for the two to just go at it. And what's amazing at that point in time, when Rocky IV first came out, the first private cars were being introduced in Beijing. Think about that for a second. If you ever want to read something interesting, read H.W. Bush's accounts of when, and even in the book Meacham wrote about him, when he talks about his time in China. When he was there in the 70s, it was bicycles. The early 80s. I mean, and they have massively grown and done so at the expense of their people. And that's how they've done it. And if you go, you'll see these. And I've been to Beijing, I've been to China. I see these cities that have just, 30 years ago were seafaring, little 30,000 pound villages, and now they're 18 million people. They can't sustain that. That's the problem that they're dealing with right now. As we get back, I want to sort of have last word. It's been a great conversation, folks. You're listening to Kelley Vlahos on the from Quincy Institute on military, Russia, Ukraine, China. It's been great. One of the aspects, and I did read a little bit of this in you made reference in some of your writings, and this is something that I'm very concerned about. How we treat our veterans when they come home and how they get out. This 20-year constant going is something that our military, and it's the on and off stop. And people will say, well, they went to World War II and were gone for 4 years and came home. Okay, if they made it home, yes, I agree with you. But they didn't come home and have 6 months at home with a wife and kids and then get shipped off again. And we're seeing a lot of that now. And it's a mental. Me being a chaplain, I have to deal with the mental aspect and spiritual aspects of our airmen all the time. It's tough. And I'm concerned that the use of the Guard, the use of the reserves, and even our active as well, we're setting ourselves up for about 5 to 10 years from now. I don't think at the VA we're even close to where the bigger problems are going to come. They're about 5 to 10 years away. How do we make that more prevalent to people when, like I said, that statistic we quoted earlier, 0.5% have served overseas in these last 20 years?
I don't know how to make it more prevalent to people. I have been working on that for my entire career. And I've said this probably too many times, but one of the reasons why I've written and I feel so passionate about veterans issues is because, like you, I grew up in the wake of the Vietnam War. And during the 80s, there was the first PTSD diagnoses, like the official diagnoses of PTSD was because of returning veterans from that war were coming home with all sorts of mental health issues, and there was no support system for them, and that was all built up because of them. But it was a major issue, and I think the standing idea at that time was never again or never forget. The MIA POW flag, never forget. Yeah, that meant for the POWs and the MIAs who were left behind. But I think broadened out, it meant we weren't going to forget our veterans ever again. And what's really disgusted me in this particular war is that they weren't prepared for the influx of veterans coming home with myriad injuries, whether it be traumatic brain injury or PTSD or different limbs lost, amputations. All of these members, all of these service members who would have died on the field in Vietnam were kept alive because of our superior medical advancements. But that means a lifetime of costs, of struggle for those particular individuals and their families. And we weren't prepared for that. And after all of what we went through as a country after Vietnam, never forget, we seem to have forgotten. And okay, so I will forgive the Americans for forgetting, quote unquote, but our institutions should have been ready. They should have learned from their mistakes. And so I feel now, like you mentioned, we have millions of veterans who have served in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who continue to serve. And we're going to wake up one morning and realize that our VA system is going to be completely overburdened. And the cost is going to bring us way, way, way into the future. And I just, how do we convey that to the American people who have no veterans in their families? They don't know people who have served. It doesn't impact them directly. I don't know, Doug. It really saddens me that we can't, that we're all rah when we're sending them into war. And then when we come home, we quickly forget, except for a Veterans Day and Memorial Day, we say thank you for your service. But I feel like that's obviously not enough.
Yeah, that you mentioned something that's one of my pet peeves in the world is Veterans Day and Memorial Day is people confusing the two, and it bothers me immensely on Veterans Day for when people we remember the sacrifices of those who lost their life. No, that's Memorial Day. Veterans Day is let's at least get the two right. But it's interesting. You talk about the POWMIA issue. I think it's Afghanistan and maybe Iraq as well, but I'm pretty sure it's Afghanistan, is the first war in which we have zero MIA with the technology and everything else. And I've seen statistics that said, that 90%, over 90% of the injuries sustained of veterans in the Iraq and Afghanistan war who are still alive, who are still with us, would have died in any other war. It's just amazing, but we've got to raise that awareness. And again, our defense is needed, our military is needed, our force is needed. It needs to be smart. The thing that always gets me is we go back to two areas. Listen to your ground troops, listen to your enlisted, listen to your lower level, the ones who do the job. For 20 years now, or at least 10 years now, there's been a fight almost every year about the Warthog, the plane in the military, the Air Force. The Air Force keeps trying to get rid of, and it's not the Air Force. Our Air Force brass wants it gone, and it's the Marines and the Army keep saying no. Those are the things that keep us alive. We need those. It's the most amazing fight I've ever. The A-10 is just an amazing fight, but yet we have the F-130. They say, oh, the F-130 can do all that. No, they can't. The F-130 was sold to you. And do I have to just, and look, I'm an Air Force guy. Look, we've had our own issues. But, F-22 ring a bell? I mean, did you realize the F-22, I believe this was true, did not deploy to Iraq until almost 12 when we were getting out because they could not service? They never deployed. Our F-16s, which were 30 years old, which I was there on the flight line with them every night, those bad boys were going off every night, and they cost $1.5 million, $1.5 million a piece. Now I might be wrong on that, so if you're out there on the go to the Doug Collins podcast website and you can complain all you want, go to the comments. I may have my pricing off, but in reality, compared to the F-35 or F-22, it was there. Last point, Eisenhower was right, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I think it goes right back to the special interests in the Pentagon. So a lot of these programs, like the F-35, are a hobby horse of particular constituencies within the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about. And so those constituencies who have the most lobbyists on the Hill, who are most connected to those in the acquisitions and procurement, will end up getting their programs through and funded. But that doesn't mean that they are the best, that they're the most capable, that they'll be able to fight the next war. And that whole issue with the A-10 is a perfect example. Those guys will tell you, the guys that worked on those programs years ago will tell you that the constituencies, the special interests in the Pentagon, won over. And it's what does this do? This puts our troops in the field in harm's way, because if they're flying planes that are not up to snuff, that have failed testing but had been pushed through because of special interests, that's putting them at risk. And I do agree that Eisenhower had predicted all of that. I just don't know what he would say today to see that military-industrial complex in full flourish. I mean, how surprised he even might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to, maybe at some point we'll come back later and just do a discussion on the intertwining of what has happened at the Pentagon. And both from the right and the left, it's been there with generals, and for the first time in the last, 5-6 years on the Trump administration and and I think President Trump realized probably that was a mistake after it went a little bit further. But again, Mattis was a great general. I'm just not sure he should be in a part of the the second defense. In hindsight, at the time, I'll have to say yeah. But now I'm looking back at it now, and Austin has been, from my opinion, extremely problematic. Let's just put it that way as we go forward. Kelley, this has been a great conversation for veterans out there, for folks who are still serving, for the general public, is to know that military sounds like an easy option. We think of our military many times as a 911 force for the world. We're not. Okay? We're the best in the world. Our folks are the best. Bottom line, hands down, I'll put us up against anybody in the world. Now, others are not bad. I think we're still the best. And if we ever get into that, as I said earlier in this podcast, everybody's in trouble at that point. So we got to look at how this plays out geopolitically with the Ukraine, other places, and say, hey, maybe we can walk ourselves out of this where, we're not letting the bullies win, but at the same point in time, we're also not fighting something that in the end, frankly, you're not going to win either way. So we get that. Kelley, thanks for being part of the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Folks, I don't know about you, but I cannot stand a towel that simply moves water around me after my shower. I like a towel that grabs you, takes the water, gets it off of you, and does what a towel's supposed to do, dry you off. I've had so many towels I bought over time. Some are expensive, some were cheap, but again, when they just sort of move the water around, I could just stay in the shower and stayed wet. I need a towel that gets me dry. That's where our friends at MyPillow come in. They have towels, and you're not going to believe the bargain that they have right now. Mike and the folks at MyPillow have offered a 6-piece towel set. That's 2 bath towels, 2 hand towels, and 2 washcloths, regularly $109.99 for $39.99. All you got to do is have code word Collins. You can go to mypillow.com, or you can call them at 1-800-986-3994. If you want towels that actually do what they're supposed to do, dry you off. That's what we do here on the Doug Collins podcast. We talk about real answers and real solutions for a complicated world. Well, sometimes you may not think that getting water off of you is a complicated process, but undoubtedly it is for some towel companies. It's not for the folks at MyPillow who actually have a towel, the MyTowel, which is a great investment for you. And right now you can get it on sale regularly $109.99 for only $39.99. And that is with code word Collins. Also, anything else that you want to go on there, you can still got the slippers, you still got the MyPillows, you still got everything that is on that wonderful website. You want to go check it out. Use code name Collins and get your discounts. Folks at MyPillow are waiting on you right now.